Richard Dawkins' book came out about 3 to 4 years ago.
Yeah, so and it's got a perfectly fine reception. I mean, and there's no evidence that he's being oppressed, even though maybe he should be.
I don't think I use the word oppressed.
Salutations. Continuing with Chapter 3, we can skip past the section on what Professor Dawkins calls the argument from Scripture, because it's entirely about literal interpretations of the Bible and is relevant to almost nobody. So we get to the so-called argument from admired religious scientists, which is a strangely clunky title. I think that the learned professor is intentionally trying to conflate two different things in order to produce a guilt by association. The actual problem he's pointing to is the appeal to authority, which is a logical fallacy in which the offender claims that something is true because intelligent people or the majority experts agree with it, instead of providing a real argument. Funnily enough, I see this all the time from atheists but never from religious people. What the professor does is drag in those who invoke the names of non-materialist scientists as a counterpoint, which is in all cases intended as a refutation of appeals to authority, and of the stereotype of stupid believers and clever atheists. Peeling back the layers, we find hypocrisy in Dawkins' presentation. He mentions how many clever people aren't religious throughout the whole book. In other words, it's alright when we name drop scientists, but when you do it, it's wrong. Now we finally get Pascal's wager. Blaise Pascal was a mathematician and engineer who lived in a time and place where the only religion around was Christianity. For him, the choices available seemed to be religion, viz. Christianity, or non-religion, viz. Naturalism. Obviously, under binary logic, one should hedge their bets on Christianity, because of the relative consequences of each position. Unfortunately, as the charts show, this argument is reduced to insanity when you factor in the existence of other religions and denominations. Dawkins then gives us a Bayesian probability argument made by a risk management consultant called Stephen Unwin. It's exactly as silly as it sounds. The numbers he feeds into the Bayes equation are completely arbitrary, as Dawkins points out. This is how the learned professor chooses to close Chapter 3. Chapter 4 is where we get the professor's main argument against religion, and it must be remembered that he is representing religion with his fallacious God hypothesis from Chapter 2. Dawkins begins with the creationist analogy about the probability of a tornado going through a tip and randomly assembling a functioning aeroplane, then plays uno reverso with it by making the plane represent God rather than an organism, calling it the ultimate Boeing 747. The original argument was incredibly stupid, but Professor Dawkins thinks that if he uses the exact same argument, it is somehow no longer stupid. Unfortunately, we're going to have to crash the professor's plane with no survivors. Dawkins thinks that the God he has imagined for himself is a complex assembly of parts, like a creature, a sort of big guy, if you will, and that if you took off these parts he would die. From the Platonic perspective, the first principle of existence is not a plexus or a structure, it is the one, it is the good, and it is nothing beyond that. It is simpler than the simplest subatomic particle, and self-perfect in its self-contained unity. The complexity of phenomenal reality is the final stage in an outward expansion or progression, a sort of evolution, if I might be so bold, from unity to diversity, ending in base matter. The Christian and Muslim metaphysicians, regardless of how well their other specific theological claims mesh with this one, assert unreservedly that their God is perfectly simple, immaterial, and not composed of parts. The professor goes on a tangent about the use of gendered language within his tangent about what he calls consciousness-raising tactics, in which he thinks the use of words like mankind is sexist, while praising Latin homo and Greek anthropos for being gender-neutral. If he'd taken 5 minutes to look up what he's talking about, he would have known that the word man is gender-neutral, and simply means human being in Old English. Hey, if Dawkins is allowed to go on tangents that have no relevance to the subject, then so am I. He then says this: who, before Darwin, could have guessed that something so apparently designed as a dragonfly's wing or an eagle's eye was really the end product of a long sequence of non-random but purely natural causes? How about Empedocles of Acragas in the 5th century BC? He said that the features of organisms could change seemingly randomly and were then selected by the creature's ability to survive and produce offspring which inherited similar features. How about Plato? In the Timaeus, the demiurge assigns the formation of living bodies to the powers of nature within the material cosmos, This interpretation was supported by Proclus and by Emperor Julian, as we covered in Against the Galileans. How about Augustine and Thomas Aquinas? Both agreed with Plato and said that there are secondary, natural causes that produced and developed the bodies of the world over time, and that they are still growing and developing today. Of course, the Stoics and the Epicureans also agreed with this. Once again, we find that the moment Professor Dawkins dips his toe into any subject besides his own, he immediately begins to drown. Or, to use another analogy, he didn't fly so good. Dawkins goes on for a while about creationism, which really is completely irrelevant to theology. Even if creationism were actually true, then alien creatures that actually evolved could be responsible for making life here, so it just doesn't mean anything. Now we get to hear all about the God of the Gaps. The learned professor acknowledges that it was in fact Christian theologians who first condemned this sort of thought process, which places the hand of God in every place where a natural explanation isn't currently available. What Dawkins fails to realise is why these theologians, and more sophisticated religious people in general, dislike the God of the Gaps. He thinks it's because they're afraid of the gaps being filled in, leaving nowhere for the gap god to hide. The truth of the matter is that even if there is a superpowered supernatural being in one of these gaps, that wouldn't be a god. At least, it wouldn't be the kind of god that the philosophers and theologians actually believe in. The gods, or God, of the philosophers don't live in gaps, and they don't stand around in the physical world playing around with matter like stickle bricks. Looking for gods in the gaps is like looking for trees in your pocket while standing in a forest. If we refer to our list from moments ago, those same people put natural forces into all of these gaps. See how Proclus describes it. For since, in short, physiology receives a threefold division, and one part of it is conversant with matter and material causes, but another part also adds the investigation of form, and evinces that which is the more principal cause, and again, since the third part demonstrates that these have not the relation of causes, but of concauses, and admits that there are other causes, which are properly so called, of things generated by nature, viz. The effective, paradigmatic and final cause, for Anaxagoras, who appears to have seen, while the rest were asleep, that intellect is the first cause of generated natures, makes no use of intellect in his explanation of things, but rather employed certain airs and ethers as the causes of things that are generated. Next, we're going to hear all about the anthropic principle. Yes, the anthropic principle, as Professor Dawkins tells us. All the other anthropic principles that don't match Dawkins' version and aren't compatible with his arguments can just be swept under the rug for convenience. The version the professor describes is most akin to Carter's version of the weak anthropic principle, which is essentially just a roundabout and pretentious way of saying selection bias. If you roll a die and get a 6 10 times in a row, you may be forgiven to think that the die is loaded. We can be astonished that our die landed on a 6, but it had to land somewhere, and 6 is no more unlikely than any other number. When you've got enough dice, eventually it's going to happen. As Sir Terry Pratchett put it, 1,000,000 to 1 chances crop up 9 times out of 10. In the case of the universe, people may assume that it's rigged in our favour, when in fact it is us who have developed in order to fit into this world. We can imagine a creature on a tremendously hot planet saying something like, "If our planet were any colder than it is, us magma folk couldn't exist. This planet was set up perfectly to support silicon-based life." Such notions are very self-centered and childish, containing the assumption that the rest of the world revolves around you, so to speak. Aligning ourselves to the cosmic center is the most general trait of traditional religious thought, so such fine-tuning arguments are actually running against the traditional worldview. After this, Professor Dawkins finally tries to address what every theologist for the past 5,000 years has been saying, which runs completely counter to his own personal concept of God, but has conveniently remained unmentioned throughout his attempted counter-arguments in the previous chapters, this being divine simplicity. Dawkins explains to us that the idea of divine simplicity is an arbitrary assertion without any reason behind it, because anything capable of producing a complex system has to be complex.
Now that was hilarious!
Yes, it was really funny.
You suppose they meant it to be?
I would like to remind you that this is an evolutionary biologist who in this very book has repeatedly and continuously hammered home the point that the complexity of modern biodiversity is the result of an extremely simple process of natural selection. The fact that a man of such unquestionable intelligence has managed to twist himself into such an insanely idiotic position is nothing short of miraculous in and of itself. In any case, Dawkins has absolutely no basis on which to assert that God is complex, as we've already covered, and even if this God does have complex extensions like the Christian Trinity or personal henads, there is no reason why they can't be an emergent property deriving from a perfectly simple substance. The professor appeals to Daniel Dennett's analogy of cranes and skyhooks, which has always been a horrible analogy because it is completely upside down. Everyone else is standing firmly on the ground of first principles and trying to build upwards, with or without the crane of evolution, while the materialists have tried to set their crane up several hundred feet in the air, and they're looking down at us and asking what our feet are hanging from. Inevitably, that crane is going to come crashing back down, with no survivors. Anyway, that's all for today. Thanks for watching and have a nice day.